Do you want to be part of a leading organization? I mean, a cutting edge trendsetter? I mean, I know I do. And if you're part of the church, there are some ways that we lead. Christians on average are more generous with their time and finances than the rest of the US population. That's pretty cool, right? But there are other areas where the church, where we once led, we now lag behind significantly. And so today we're going to talk with Bryan Loritts about one of those areas, and maybe we'll find our way back to leading again. So Bryan, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation, and I've enjoyed learning through your books and so on. And so I'm excited for this conversation. But before we get going, would you give us a cliff notes of your life? Where were you born? Where were you raised? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, I was born in Media, Pennsylvania. It's a little town just outside of Philadelphia, the early 70s. And ultimately, our family migrated down south to Atlanta, Georgia. We were a part of what sociologists would call the reverse migration. Of course, the Great Migration really happened early part, even mid part of the 20th century, where blacks were leaving the Jim Crow South. But early 70s on into the 80s and 90s, African Americans kind of looped back, many down south. For economic reasons, post Jim Crow. So we were a part of that wave. Atlanta is really what I call home. It's where I grew up. It's where I graduated high school. And then I graduated in 1991 and headed off to Philadelphia to go to college, graduated from there, then went to the West Coast, Talbot School of Theology in the Los Angeles area, worked at a couple churches out there, met my wife, Corey. We've been married coming up on 27 years. We've got 3 boys. Quentin is 24, Miles is 23, Jaden is 21. And now we're here in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I am serving as the teaching pastor at the Summit Church.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I figured by the amount of gray you have in your beard that we were probably born very close to.
Yep.
So I'm born in 72. So it sounds like we're we might geek out on some Gen X stuff at some point here during this conversation. But before we get to some of that stuff, I'd love to just talk a little bit about this concept that you bring up for us, which is the offensive church. Now I'm reading offensive as in offense versus defense, meaning that we are making the charge, but would you, versus offensive, where we are just offending the world. Would you talk to us a little bit about what the offensive church is and kind of give people maybe some handholds so that we can kind of refer to that as we continue through this conversation?
Well, first, I love how people don't know what to do with that word in the title. And that's very intentional. It's a bit of a double entendre. You know, is it offensive? Is it offensive? I would say it's both. That when the church plays offense in the area of what I call ethnic unity, there will be many in the world who will find it offensive. So, the church is kind of the last institution outside of the Greek systems on university campus to be, by and large, lagging behind the culture as it relates to diversity, as it relates to ethnic unity. And so I think the numbers were, so a multi-ethnic church is one in which meets the 80-20 rule, where no one ethnicity makes up more than 80% of the whole. Okay. And if you use that metric, which sociologists give us, thinking Dr. Corey Edwards, associate professor of sociology at Ohio State University, that's a major benchmark that she does. So if you use that metric, I think in 1997, 1998, only 2.5% of all Protestant churches would be multi-ethnic. Now that number has really creeped up. That number, the last stat I saw was January of 2020, and that number was up to, I want to say 22%. So it's creeping up. If we include mainline denominations, the number goes higher, but we're still lagging behind. So I wrote that book kind of as a resource to help churches to think through what are the major buckets that I need to be paying attention to help create an environment that's conducive to ethnic unity.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about ethnic unity and kind of the gospel's vision of that, and how that maybe differs from maybe our cultural vision of what diversity looks like. What do we see Jesus saying about diversity and what that should look like?
Yeah, I love how you framed your question. I intentionally call it ethnic unity and not ethnic diversity, because Jesus' last prayer, John 17, prior to the cross, was not a prayer for diversity, but a prayer for unity. And I think you can be diverse but not unified. I mean, listen, our country since its inception was diverse, but we also had slavery, which tells us it wasn't unified. And so I'm very intentional in the language. What we're after is what Jesus prayed for, and that's unity, ethnic unity. In fact, I think if you're ethnically diverse without being ethnically unified, you'll end up homogenous. You will lose diversity if you don't experience unity, right? And so I frame everything the way that I see the Bible framing this, which is gospel. So, what's interesting is the norm in the New Testament world. If you just read through the book of Acts, the norm was multi-ethnic churches. Paul walks into a town. He asks two questions. Where's the synagogue? Right? I want to preach Christ to the Jews. By the way, this is what he means in Romans 1:16 when he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, not to the Jew only, but to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. Yes, I think we can quote that evangelistically, but I also think Paul's giving us kind of his missiology. Like, he walks into town, he wants to see the whole town reached for the gospel. And so Acts 16, it's Philippi. Acts 17, it's Athens. Acts 18, it's Corinth. Acts 19, it's Ephesus. And this is his playbook. Preach Christ to the Jews at the synagogue. Some Jews come and get saved. And then he goes, well, where do the Gentiles hang out? In Athens, they point him up to the Areopagus, Mars Hill. And he, points to an altar dedicated to an unknown God, preaches Christ, and some Gentiles come to faith. Now he's got a problem, right? He's got a problem. Because in the first century world, these two groups, they don't come together. And so I think if Paul were using the church growth kind of playbook, that McGavern and Peter Wagner and those guys used in the mid 20th century, late 20th century, I think what he would do is he'd start two churches, one for each of these groups, right? Highly pragmatic. It's called the homogeneous unit principle. So let's start a church on the north side of town for the Gentiles, church on the south side of town for the Jews. But that's not what Paul does. He goes, no, now that you've been reconciled vertically to God through Christ, I am now going to call you to work that out horizontally with one another. And so, this was the norm. And so this is why, for example, have you ever wondered why you're reading Corinthians? Why does Paul spend so much time talking about food? Right? Well, in a homogeneous church, food is not an issue. Right. But when the Gentile family invites the Jewish family after church over to their house for lunch, and they decide to cook pork chops, we've got an issue here. You know what I'm saying? Right. And so this is kind of the beautiful mess, as one of my friends say, of the multi-ethnic church. So I guess what I'm saying here is, in Paul's framework of the gospel, everything begins with vertical reconciliation. And now that you've been reconciled vertically, the gospel says display that horizontally. And once I saw this, you can't unsee it. Last thing I'll say, the classic passage for this is Ephesians 2. So if you just read the opening 10 verses, it's vertical reconciliation. Saved by grace through faith, God being rich in mercy. But then he gets to verse 11 and he says, therefore, which means what I'm about to say is connected to what I just said. You Gentiles in the flesh, he's talking now ethnic Gentiles, And now he pivots from vertical reconciliation to horizontal reconciliation. So I actually think the multi-ethnic church is the strongest visible apologetic for the power of the gospel. When you get people doing life with one another, and it's not just ethnic, but rich and poor, when you get people doing life with one another that should not do life with each other, and the reason why they're in the room with each other is because of the cross of Christ,
right?
That is a powerful demonstration of the gospel. But if you untether that from the gospel, now you're left with nothing else but a progressive agenda, which is diversity for the sake of diversity. And so we've got to keep the gospel the main thing. But the Bible knows nothing of a gospel that doesn't seep out into my relationships with my ethnic others, with the poor, with the wealthy. I mean, these are indicator lights. So,
yeah. No, I love that. And I love how you kind of, you set it up where when Paul would go into a town, he had very much purposefully set out who he was going to talk to. And then once people started to find Jesus, like you say, it wasn't so that they could go into their own little closets and like, okay, here's our little places, and maybe we'll have an annual prayer meeting together or a worship night where we all come together. You're going to have to figure this out. I want to talk a little bit about that, the struggle of it. Can we talk about the struggle of all kinds of coming together? You've mentioned ethnic, of course, but we talk about socioeconomic, we talk about language and all of those things. Can you talk a little bit about how we work out that struggle? Like it isn't easy. Pork chops to a Jew is not an easy thing to overcome. So what are some kind of framework maybe that you have to help people kind of like, how do we do some of that messiness?
Well, I think it begins by us having the humility to say, we have been shaped and formed. All of us are the product of our experiences and our lack of experiences. And so no one is a blank sheet of paper. We've been profoundly formed. And a lot of our formation is not good. It runs counter to the gospel. Unless you have the humility to see that, then I don't think we'll have much hope going forward. That's why I think discipleship is both formation and deformation, where we have to, the gospel gives me a completely different set of lenses. And so this isn't just a word for my white siblings. It's a word for my Black siblings. It's a word for my Latina. It's a word for everybody, right? So if you just put it in an ethnic box, I come into the church and I see a whole bunch of, let's say, white people. I have presuppositions there. Some good, maybe some not so good. And the primary way that my biases and presuppositions are challenged is not by reading a book. It's not by going to a museum. It's by immersing myself in relationship with the ethnically other. And this is what Paul gets to, by the way, in his classic passage on contextualization in 1 Corinthians 9. He talks about, to the Jew, I became a Jew. And then later on, he says, to those outside the law, I became as those outside the law are Gentiles. And he keeps using this phrase, I have become, I have become, I have become. Well, one commentator says the essence of that phrase means the ability to step outside of yourself and immerse yourself into someone else's skin to feel what they feel. And it's a powerful concept. What Paul is saying is what is keeping him calibrated when it comes to the gospel is his relationships with the other, right? And so I want you to process this in the area of marriage. I came into marriage with some presuppositions about women, let's say, and nothing has shaped me more nothing has challenged me more than being in covenant relationship with someone who is completely different than me. It's a means of grace in my life. And so for the person who's struggling, I would say, well, what you need to be formed is you need relationship with the ethnically other. Or if you're a Democrat, you need a relationship with Republican. If you're a Republican, you need a relationship with Democrats. Like, we need these things across the board. So yeah, relationships is the key.
I love that. I think that is so important, that as we get proximate to people, as we actually experience and make friendships across those kind of divides, those lines, it starts to kind of break down, like you're saying, those presuppositions of, oh, I think that person is. I was on a call just a week ago, and one of the things we do is we bring churches together to go work in low-income communities. And so somebody's asking, so what outcomes are you looking for besides really what part of the work is? And near the end of what our outcomes was, I said, you know what? One of the things is we get to bring different socioeconomic groups together to bust down those preconceived ideas of who that other person is. And somehow when we get proximate, those preconceived ideas, they just start kind of fading away because people are so nuanced and so different. And so I love that. Can you give us like one quick tip? How do we purposefully get proximate? Like, are there some places that you've seen where it's like, okay, this is great, you know, people can actually start building relationships in some of these spaces?
Yeah, I think it begins with prayer. I think just making that an area of prayer where you go, God, there's a gap in my life here. And I feel like I need to be challenged. I feel like I can really grow. Would you send me whatever type of person by way of relationship? I think the next step is trying to immerse yourself in context where you can find that right kind of friend. It's got to be the right context, right? And that's where I think a multi-ethnic church is helpful. Or if there's a church that is primarily of the ethnicity of the kind of person that you're going, I need to have friends over here. Then I'd start hanging out, at some sort of a gathering, ministry gathering, maybe a worship experience or whatever. And I think it's important, you don't want to walk into your first time hanging out with a person and kind of have, a DTR with them, right? Where you just go, hey, I've been praying and we're going to be friends. No, don't do that. That's weird.
Right.
Ease into it. We know this about friendships. You can't engineer them. They're this organic thing where it either happens or it doesn't. But just making yourself intentional and open to the possibility and prayerful, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah. I love that. And it's amazing how God starts providing opportunities. And I think part of it is because we're starting to put our brain towards this is important and bringing, God and the Spirit in. But
yeah.
God's pretty faithful to give opportunities for some of those places. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and kind of talk about this. And this was kind of a 90s thing, but that idea of colorblindness and why that just isn't the best approach to kind of this multi-ethnic church, So would you talk a little bit about colorblindness and why that's not a great approach?
Yeah, I do appreciate the sentiment behind it. I think most people who use that very wrong concept, I have a lot of grace for them, because I think what they're trying to say is, I am not going to approach this kind of with worldly eyes. I am not going to hold you to or hold you hostage to whatever biases, presuppositions. Unfortunately, Satan has just done a number on us, especially in America, in the area of color. So I get it. The problem is that I read Revelation 5, Revelation 7, where John talks about in his heavenly vision, looking up into heaven and seeing people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. Well, how would he know on sight differences in people groups unless he sees differences in color? Right? And so ethnicity is not a fruit of the fall. Race is. Race is a fruit of the fall. Race is a social construct by and which I extend or extract value from people based on the color of their skin. That's demonic. Ethnicity is not. In fact, in the Bible, especially New Testament, Greek word ethnos is oftentimes used. My ethnicity is created. And the very fact that it's a part of my future eternal reality, it's going to be in heaven, tells me that it is not a fruit of the fall. So if a part of how God has made me, Psalm 139, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. A part of that is my ethnicity. So God doesn't see me in a colorblind lens. He doesn't privilege me because of my race, and he doesn't deprivilege me because of my race. This is a part of how he's created me. And so I think that's where we have to get, is that we're able to see people in the fullness of how God's created them. And I think the tension is, I want to avoid colorblindness because that's not a part of the biblical vision. But I also want to, on the other extreme, avoid ethnic idolatry. That is where my ultimate sense of identity is found in my race. No, both of those are deeply problematic. So I think coming to Christ, he doesn't expect me to divest myself of my ethnicity. But he does expect me to subjugate every dimension of who I am to his lordship, so that the thing that's predominant is the lordship of Christ. That's why Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we regard no man according to the flesh. And so we see it. Paul sees it. That's why he goes, I'm going to the Jews, and then where do the Gentiles hang out? He sees it. He just doesn't elevate it as the primary thing.
Yeah. In society, we do this kind of higher, lower. Some people are lifted up. Some people are pulled down. How do we be authentic and respected and celebrated? And I feel like sometimes when we celebrate somebody, it's like, oh, I'm going to celebrate that, but we're going to have to denigrate another, something else in order to take that place. How do we do it where there is a lifting up to equality versus kind of I'm going to just say some get lifted up and some get pushed down? We see this trend where, everybody has to have a seat at the table. There's only 10 seats. And so if somebody takes seat number 10, then we got to kick out whoever was in that seat. Versus saying, no, let's just bring an 11th seat to this table. Like we can bring somebody in and we're all now equal. So I guess my question is, how do we allow the authenticity of a person's ethnicity to be respected and to be celebrated without us having to denigrate another person in that process?
Yeah. So I think this idea of what you're talking about, making sure people have a seat at the table, I think that's good if it ties directly into the mission. So, for example, if you read Acts chapter 6, Acts chapter 6 is telling. And I'm using these loaded words intentionally, but I'm not using them the way the world does. Acts chapter 6, there's a lot there that we can unpack along the lines of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I mean by that is, church is going and blown in Acts, and then they hit one heck of a bump in the road. Acts 6, the Hellenistic Jews are being overlooked. Hellenism is the spread of Greek culture. This is not a good thing. The apostles say, listen, we're not going to get down into the weeds in this. We're going to give ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. But this is an issue that has to be dealt with. So here you have ethnic Jews who are culturally Greek being overlooked. So they're being neglected. And so the disciples say, we got to pick some people to handle this. And if you read the list of names that they pick, Each of those names are Greek. That's not by accident. They are intentionally picked for leadership positions to address a real need in the church. Now, there's character qualifications. They got to be full of the Holy Spirit. They've got to be devout people, right? But what's driving that isn't just diversity or equity or inclusion for the sake of diversity, equity, inclusion. What's driving that is mission. And so if I'm coaching a local church and the church's community is really diverse, and let's say it's a historically white church with a historically white community, but a growing Latino presence, growing African-American presence, I'm going to counsel that church. You need to think through in your hiring to hire well-qualified people who, some of which are also Latino, some of which are also African-American. Why? What's driving that is the mission. This is what your mission field looks like, right? And so I appreciate the sentiment of we just need a diversity of voices, and I think there's a place for that. But I think it's best done when it's not done for its own sake, but for a greater cause, which is advancing the mission of Christ.
I love that. I appreciate that. One of the things you talk about in your book is the idea that leadership needs to get this. It's one thing to hire Hispanic, African-American, or so on, but if they're not empowered, by the leader, if the leader is not living it out, it won't trickle down to the church. Can you talk a little bit about what like senior leadership looks like in an organization and how that can kind of affect the whole process as you move towards a multi-ethnic church?
Yeah, I think it's a rookie mistake in leadership where well-meaning senior leaders catch a vision for this and think that if I hire the right minority, I can outsource this vision to them. No, this thing needs to be baked into the culture of the church. And the best way to do that is for the senior leader to be all in. I remember back in the day, there was this very well-known church in our nation that leaders were flying all over the country to go to this church to learn how they do evangelism. Well, it was no secret. The pastor was all in on evangelism. You couldn't listen to a single sermon he preached hardly without hearing him make some reference to him sharing his faith, to what he was personally doing. So I would say, remove the issue of race and diversity and ethnic unity. Anything that you're really trying to bake into the culture of your church, your people need to know that at the highest levels of leadership, they're all in. That's just leadership 101, right? If I want a generous church, I have to be a part of leading the charge personally in my own finances in modeling generosity. And so it's an absolute necessity that the senior leader doesn't have to be an expert, by the way. Don't have to be an expert in this area. What people need to see is you're moving along in this trajectory. The basic principle of leadership, I can't take people to a place that I'm not personally going to myself.
Yeah.
And that's the principle.
Yeah. I love that. Kind of in these efforts, how do we avoid becoming a monocultural church? By that, I mean, okay, we live in San Jose. Within a church, you can have a variety of ethnicities there, but culturally, everybody's, kind of fits into this kind of singular mold that doesn't really highlight any particular ethnicity. How do you do that in a congregation on a Sunday morning or through the life of the church where, hey, there's going to be kind of multiple ethnicities represented and encouraged and on a Sunday morning service. How do you do that in a way that we don't kind of wipe out? I'm going to go a little bit back to the colorblind question, I think there a touch, but like, what does a Sunday morning service look like that is, would you say, more multi-ethnic?
Well, yeah, I think there has to be some guardrails that are biblically informed, not culturally informed. So if you take let's use as an example to your question, the worship experience, the corporate worship experience on Sunday morning. I think an appropriate biblical guardrail is, as I'm talking to my worship leader, hey, when you think through your set list, I just want to make sure that every song we're singing is highly vertical and it is exalting Christ, right? I don't want to sing any songs that are ultimately about me. I want to sing songs that exalt Christ. That's a biblical guardrail. Another guardrail I would have is I would always tell my worship leaders, when you pick the set list, I also want you to think intergenerationally and along multi-ethnic lines. I want you to think older, younger. In Memphis, the language we used was black and white because those were the two predominant things. And so now I'm giving them freedom stylistically, right? Mm-hmm. Substantively, there's no wiggle room. Stylistically, the guardrail is you have to vary the style, right? Mm-hmm. And so what they were real skilled at was taking a gospel song that would really resonate with our African-American community, but stylistically presenting in such a way that was somewhat palatable to our white constituency. Here's the thing. In the worship experience, I feel like if we sang every song that we liked the way that you liked it, we just did you a disservice, because worship is not about you. So everybody during the set should have a feeling of disequilibrium. Ooh, this is strange, unfamiliar, but hey, it's talking about Christ, so I can get with it, right? That's what we were really going after there. And then what I'm doing as the senior leader is I've got my worship leaders back saying, hey, I know for some of you, this might felt a little off, but if you just turned and look at your neighbor, what you didn't identify with, they've got tears streaming down their face because we just took them back to their childhood, and it's exalting Christ. So you should be able to get with it. So, but that's a constant thing. Making sure there's appropriate, well-qualified representation on the stage, worship team, band, who's doing announcements. I'm always looking at that. Not from a tokenism perspective. You know, I tell everybody, if Jackie Robinson couldn't hit, the project of integrating baseball would have failed. He won Rookie of the Year. What made it work was, yes, he was African American, and yes, he was competent. So we're not talking about incompetence. I'm not saying put people on your worship team who have the right color but can't sing. We're not saying that at all, but we are saying, so that's an example that I think could help bring clarity to your question.
Yeah. Give a good framework for people. All right, I'm going to switch gears on you a little bit here. I want to talk about music. It seems like you are a music lover. I had never heard of Coleman Hawkins, who you mentioned in your book. And so I actually paused the book and I went straight to Coleman Hawkins and listened to some of his music. Grateful for Spotify that lets us do that. Are you a live music guy? Do you go to shows? Is that something that you do? Or
I enjoy shows. I probably go to about one a year, just because the way my schedule works. But I'm a big jazz guy. I enjoy shows, but it would be a stretch to say I'm big into live shows. I enjoy them, but I don't get out as much as I'd like to.
Yeah. Are there any jazz musicians you can point us to that maybe newer?
Yeah, my favorite modern day jazz vocalist and I think he would classify himself this way. Gregory Porter.
Okay.
Love Gregory Porter. But I'm old school jazz. I'm talking Miles Davis. I'm talking Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Dave Brubeck, that whole vibe.
That crew. Okay. And that's kind of where I've landed. And I have a very eclectic music tastes, and jazz is one of them. And it's interesting because I don't connect with any like of the newer. I mean, I'll listen to the music and it's like, oh, this is nice, but it's more background for me versus some that you've mentioned, the Miles Davis and kind of John Coltrane and all, where you can just sit down and listen to it. Like your head is just kind of right there with them. It doesn't have to be background music.
Yeah.
Hey, I'd like to talk a little bit about your latest book, Grace to Overcome.
Yep.
A great devotional, and super fun. If you guys are Audible listeners, the each chapter is 4, 5, 6 minutes. And so you get a really cool little story snippet and a great connection to a biblical principle. Of the 31, I think, characters there, which ones kind of stood out to you? Like when you kind of look back over the book, what are the ones that stood out to you? Like, man, that one really sings, not to continue on the music one, but that one really sings, from a gospel connected historical kind of perspective.
I really like Jerry Lawson. He's Silicon Valley guy, where you're at. He's the father of the modern gaming system. I love Emmett McHenry. He's the one who came up with a complex code that made the internet accessible. So every time you're on the internet, you have Emmett to thank. Alice Parker. She came up with the patent for the modern day heating apparatus in our homes. So for those of us on the East Coast this time of year, when it gets chilly and we go to our thermostats, we have a Black woman in New Jersey in the early 20th century to thank. Really had fun writing Whitney Houston's when she sang the national anthem. Really enjoyed that. They're so varied. Some of them were really hard for me to come to terms with, like the Tuskegee study that they did, where they analyzed men over decades who had syphilis, just to see what would happen to them, even though they had the cure for it. And this was a government-led thing. That was a tough one to write. There's a lot of music in there. There's James Brown, there's Michael Jackson, there's Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, there's Sammy Davis Jr. There's some athletes in there as well, Jesse Owens, so on and so forth. So I've definitely varied them, men, women, entertainers, you had politicians in there, in critical moments in history. So of all the books I've written, I had the most fun writing that one.
Yeah. It just, that came out in the writing. That just really came out. I'm going to tell you the ones that I enjoyed, I think the most. The Jesse Owens story. Yeah. Jesse Owens was a hero growing up. Like, I just remember watching shows about him and just being so intrigued. And my dad is kind of a bit of a, like, anytime we get to stick it to somebody. So with Jesse Owens sticking it to Hitler, like, yep, that just made him a hero in our home growing up. But then the way you took that story, it was one that I had not heard before. Do you want to share a little bit of the story that you shared there around?
Yeah, sure. The Olympics? I think I called it Jesse Needs a Hug. And, the thing that we all know is 1936 Olympics, and he wins 4 gold medals. He almost doesn't win for the long jump. And the way he tells it, one of his Nazi competitors prayed with him, hugged him. And because of that, he wins. And then he comes back home, falls on hard times, has to end up racing horses and eking out a living. And And then he talks about this friendship with his Nazi competitor, and the guy ends up dying in one of the battles there in World War II. And Jesse reads this letter, this last letter he got from him. It's a real tearjerker of a story. And you're going, why haven't I heard of this before? Why isn't there a movie based on this? Well, only to discover Jesse made the whole thing up. And he made it up for a really good reason. And I'll leave that really good reason out. But that was the historical angle there.
Yeah. I love that. And I got to be honest with it, because of the great reason behind it. And again, y'all go get the book. I think it was the first devotion in the book. I have not lost any respect for Jesse whatsoever. It was one of those where you're like, yeah, I get it. And I think a lot of that is back to humility, which you talked about, and ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And I think if you're able to do that, you can have empathy for a man who went through what he did, highs and lows and all of that. Okay. I'm going to have you talk about, I think one more. And I did not write down the gentleman's name, but it was the I'm assuming a kid, but the kid who went swimming, didn't want to go down to Tampa Bay to go swimming that day, decided to go to the local pool, which had been integrated, but in law, but not in reality. And so would you talk about, and I think you called that one Not Today. So I love that one. What was, tell me us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, that's David. I think it's, I always get the mispronounce. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think it's Isom, Isom. Yeah, it's, in the 1950s, down in Florida, on paper, they had desegregated the local swimming pool, but culturally they had not. Everybody just knew the written rule. And so here you have a group of about 50 or so white people swimming in the whites only pool. And David just calmly walks in. I think he's around the age of 19 or so. And he's like, you know what? I'm sick of you all not really integrating the pool, even though that's the law, you're supposed to. And he just jumps right in. I wish I could have been there to see their faces, but as the story goes, all of them got this disgusted look, and they immediately got out of the pool. And the local authorities actually shut down the pool for a while, and finally they decided that what they had on paper they need to live out in reality. And that one moment where he made the decision not to go with the status quo. And then I just related that to the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel chapter 3, and they had their own not today moment where everybody else is going to bow. That's the status quo. We're not going to bow. And then when given an opportunity behind closed doors to bow, they said, no, we're good. And just going, well, what's your not today moment? What is it in your life that you've just accepted that God is saying, no, I don't want you to give into the status quo on this? I think we all have ours. And there should be a little bit of a David-ism inside of us.
Yeah. I love that story. I love that. Okay. I think this is the last one I'm going to pick up from the book, but Moses' wife, Zipporah, and how Moses' family responds to it, and then how God responds to it. So tell us a little bit about Zipporah and kind of the application you had on that one there.
Well, the story for that is, I couldn't believe this. I was reading David Blight's biography on Frederick Douglass, which is one of my favorite biographies I've ever read. Frederick Douglass is considered to be the most photographed man of the 19th century, which is pretty astounding, being an African-American abolitionist, incredible orator. His first wife was black. She dies. And I don't know how I missed this in all my years of just kind of hearing about Frederick Douglass, but his second wife was white, daughter of abolitionists, who, this is the crazy maker, who pretty much disowned their daughter. Abolitionists disowned their daughter for marrying a black guy, right? which tells you, I think it was pretty common among abolitionists of that day. They wanted legal equality, not social equality. Those are two really different things. That is a common. Harry Truman was that way. LBJ was that way. Big fighters for legal equality, but had no problem dropping the N word. Didn't want social equality at all. Anyways, so, I tell that story, interracial relationships, whatever. And then I say, well, they're not the only family to have a hard time with their relative's choice of a mate. And I take them to Numbers, I think it's Numbers chapter 12, where Moses, his wife, is from Africa. She's described as being a Cushite, and Cush literally means black. And over again in that passage, they describe her as being a Cushite. So we see color connotations. Miriam and her brother Aaron, they challenge Moses. They don't like it at all. God then intervenes and says, hey, Moses, step out of the way. I'll take care of this. And he lets them have it. And when he's done, it says that Miriam was bright like snow. And so here you have this text that has this theme of color, where God in so many ways says, okay, Miriam, you want to find your identity in color? I'll make you white, leprous white. And the irony there is it's deeper than color. If you had leprosy, you were placed outside the camp. And that had a deep social stigma. So here's Miriam treating Zipporah like Zipporah's the outsider and Miriam's the insider. And just like that, God flips the table and makes Miriam the outsider. And I think it's a profound message that in the economy of God, what makes us insiders has nothing to do with our skin. What makes us insiders is our relationship with him. And that's a profound lesson that I think, unfortunately, is still necessary as so many people wrestle with interracial relationships. And then I end by saying, isn't it tragic that for so many Christians, they're fine being your brother in Christ, just not being your brother-in-law?
I love that. So good. So y'all, go grab that book. It is a fun devotional, and there's so many more stories. You've just talked about 3 of them here, but there's 28 more, and they're fun like that. So, and you suggest doing it with friends, family, maybe even people who are from a different ethnicity, so you can actually start getting, good interaction and better understanding around this. Again, a tool that you can use to kind of help break down some of these barriers and so on. Okay. I'm down to my last 2 questions for you. Here's one. I kind of heard a theme through some of your writing, which is that idea that you'll go out, you'll do a training, you'll come to a church around multi-ethnic, you come home and your wife says, how did it go? And what she means is, do you think it's going to stick? Or at least that's how I read it. What keeps you going? What keeps you on this fight, on this communication, getting out in front of people, this idea of the church needs to do better around ethnicity? What's that thing that motivates you?
Yeah, it's, I think what keeps me going is the very thing that threatens to keep me going. I at least in my lifetime, I'm born post Jim Crow. These are the most divided times of my life. The political division, the rhetoric. And I'm not just talking in the culture in general. I'm talking among Christians in the house of God. And you look on people's social media and, now the very subject of race, there will be people who will hear about this and will go, yep, Bryan's woke. You know what I'm saying? And so that's deflating, deeply discouraging. But at the same time, it's exactly why we have to keep having these conversations. Because sadly, it's very much a need. I made up my mind a long time ago. I'm not laboring for my lifetime. I'm laboring for my kids' lifetime. I want to be a part of helping to shape an ancient new normal. And I use that oxymoron, ancient new, because it's not really new. We're just trying to arc the church back to our first century roots, which is how we began this conversation. So, I just think our cultural milieu, the rhetoric, the divisiveness in the church is taking gas and putting gas in my tank.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I'm grateful. I'm so grateful. When I had the opportunity to schedule this, that little voice that I had to catch in my head said, I wonder if Bryan gets sick of having this conversation. I mean, is this something that he's been doing for a long time? Is this something that, like, oh man, here we go again, one more. Mm-hmm. And so just grateful to hear that God's continuing to put gas in your tank to keep moving this forward. So thank you for that. And thanks for being here. I have one last question for you though. What's exciting you right now? What's one thing in your life? Doesn't have to be related to this. It could be in your home, a Bible verse, something happening in your church, in your community. But what's one thing that when you think about it, it puts a smile on your face?
What's interesting? What's exciting me is I'm running into more and more church planters who are wanting to plant multi-ethnic churches. That excites me. I am about to start. I just signed a contract on my next book. About to start writing that. That definitely excites me. Being a part of church planting, our church, the Summit Church, is really big on multiplying itself through church plants, and I get to spend a lot of time with church planters. Encouraging young leaders is a big excitement for me. Being a dad, being a husband, a lot of excitement. Good round of golf. I just came back from Arizona, play a little golf out there. That excites me. Good book. I've just read the best book. Have you read Theo of Golden?
No.
You have to read it. Best book I've read in 15 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You have to read it.
Okay.
You're welcome. But that excites me. So yeah, there's a lot that I just rejoice over that God's doing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Bryan, once again, thanks for being part of the podcast. Thanks for all you're doing. And for everybody out there today, let's all live faith first. Hey, you're still here. That means you enjoyed our conversation with Bryan Loritts. I always say it, but wasn't that fun? That was such a great conversation. I'm so grateful that he is out doing this work to break down divides and to encourage Jesus's church into multi-ethnicity. It's not something we should have to do, but we need to because it's broken right now in the church. Here's one thing, put it in the comments. What's one space you get to go to cross divides? Let us know where that is. Is it a coffee shop? Is it at your church? I hope it's at your church. But where is it that you get to cross divides in your community? All right, everybody, let's all live faith first.